Hello and welcome. Peak end experiences. What the heck is that? Why am I talking about it? Well, I think it is a natural follow up or follow on from yesterday's video, which was about Kairos v Chronos time. If you saw that live or watched the recording, you will know, I hope, that Chronos is linear, it's measured, in many ways it's objective, and Kairos time is more about meaning, the experience, very often the joy, the immersion into a situation, and time is different in those situations, and so it should be. And I just thought, having made that little video, that it would be interesting to look at something else, because as you may recall yesterday, again, if you watched it live or the recording, the example I was giving, a real example, was about two friends of mine who are on holiday, still on holiday right now, and I was kind of wary on their behalf of them sending videos and text messages and getting involved in group chats. And I appreciate everyone is different, but I can't help but feel that it's so important to be as present as possible when you're on a holiday. And maybe it's to a destination, to a place, a country that you might not get back to for a while, if ever. And so you really should be there and not half elsewhere in cyberspace. I've been guilty myself of doing that, so I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I guess over time I've become less inclined to share every second. I've never really shared every second, but some people will not only send photographs and videos and have video calls, but they'll live stream every darn thing that they're doing. And yesterday, someone kindly made a comment on the live video, or about the live video, the Chronos v Kairos, that isn't an example of that. The people who go to concerts and hold the phones up and essentially record it and kind of glance at the screen to make sure that they're capturing it. Once more, I have done similar things. It's not a habit that I'm into, I think, I trust, I hope, but I've definitely done similar things. And now I tend not to. So I thought it was a great example of the tech getting in the way of the experience. Not to say it doesn't have its benefits, but all things in moderation. So that then brings me neatly, logically or illogically perhaps, to this thing called the peak end experience, or the peak end rule. So here we have a little slide to help me, in fact more than one slide, to help me guide you through what I mean. So it's called the peak end rule, and how we remember experiences, why endings and highlights matter more than duration. So what does that mean? Is this a rule, or is it more a rule of thumb? Up front, I think it's more a rule of thumb, because we'll look at some contradictions to this so-called rule. But I believe it is something which definitely is a thing. It can happen, and I believe it's something that we should pay attention to. That if you did know about this may be a useful reminder. If you didn't know about it, it could be worth thinking about. Because remember, on this channel, part of what I hope to be sharing, hope to be talking about is our journey, our improvement in terms of self-leadership, how we can get the most out of life, how we can avoid the traps and the pitfalls that are there as part of potentially the human condition, you might call it that, and also because the world is a certain way. There are certain things that we've got to be aware of, and right now one of those things is tech and the seductive nature of it. I've talked about AI again in previous videos, and here I'm talking about, once more, like Chronos v Kairos, they need to be present. So the peak end rule, how we remember experiences. Let's go here first. Now, what this is a snippet from Wikipedia, which can be a really useful resource. Not always, but sometimes it can be really good. And I liked this summary. So essentially, from Wikipedia, the peak end rule is a psychological heuristic. Now, heuristic, again, just in case, you may well know what that is, but just in case, here it means rule of thumb. Kind of a generalization more than an actual rule, which is important, in which people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak, its most intense point. And so it's a heuristic, it's a rule of thumb. It's not strictly the case every time, but worth considering, as I hope we'll see. And at its end. So it's not only how they felt at its peak, its most intense point, it's also how it felt at the end. And the peak end rule tends to focus on, surprise, surprise, the end part, which over time and memory can be the most intense, as we'll see. But this doesn't negate those moments in an experience which are also intense. Hence, it's not a rule. So it's two things. We tend to judge an experience based on how they felt at the peak, the most intense point, but we also put a lot of weighting on the end, how it felt at the end, and what that peak at the end was like. And that's more about memory than in the moment. But some people would suggest that the end, it really puts a patina across all the rest of the experience. Don't quite agree with that. There are definitely exceptions. But still, we need to think about those endpoints, which we'll come on to. And so rather than based on a total sum or average of every moment in the experience, so it's not a sum, it's not an average, it's the peak points with, according to a lot of people, a considerable amount of weighting towards the end experience, the end of. The effect occurs regardless of whether the experience is pleasant or unpleasant, and that's a very important point. So when we talk about peak, it's not necessarily good. In fact, this is one of the keys to this heuristic, this rule of thumb. So then, back to the slides. Question: do we remember experiences exactly as they happened? Feel free to chip in the comments if you think yes or no. I know some people prefer just to sit back and watch and listen, and that's all absolutely fine. So let me presume that at this time of the day, because it is an unusual time of the day, it's when I could find time, but it may not be the right time for everyone else, but never mind. Is this Chronos or Kairos? I hope this is more relaxed. So do we remember? No, we don't. Emotions can codify things. They provide almost like a salience tag to our memories, whether they are worth remembering, whether we need to know about that thing, whether the emotion itself is so-called still raw that we can get, let's say, to use a sort of common phrase, triggered by events, in part because of those memories. And very often that is there as a defense mechanism. That is there to make sure that we are safe. But we certainly don't remember things exactly as they happen. Look at the witness statements that are sometimes gathered by the authorities. How reliable are they? How often are they actually contradictory? Which ones should you believe? And particularly when, let's say, the police interview people, they've got to be careful, the language that they use so they don't influence. Because also when people are in an emotional state, it is easier to create what is sometimes called a false memory. And memory is extremely fallible. Extremely fallible. Some people say that we record everything, and if maybe you've seen these things where you put a little probe on the brain. Again, we're not going to do that here, and it's not recommended unless you're fully qualified. And memories that the individual didn't know that they had are unlocked. So there's a whole debate about where memory is stored. Yes, we know certain areas, but is that all that's going on, or is it more a wave that is activated that moves across different parts of the brain, the different functional centers? And again, there's some credence given to that thought. So it could be that everything is there, it could be, but our ability to recall it very often in the recall changes it. And so when we change it, because it's almost like, you know what, this is like a really bad example, but it's one that pops to mind. If you consider people who do these brass rubbings, you heard of that? You know, people go across with like a crayon and a bit of paper, and rather than actually take a photograph, they'll rub across the surface of, let's say, a light relief or whatever it might be. And in a sense, when you look at that light relief, that rubbed kind of drawing-esque type thing, it's not an accurate rendition. One can argue that, of course, the photographs aren't an accurate rendition. The colours are going to be different for a kickoff almost all the time, and so on. So when we recall and then we remember it and we play around with that memory, when we store it again, it can be changed. Some people suggest it is always changed. So it's fallible, and we don't remember things exactly as they happened. Now, again, I can perhaps hear some thoughts at this point in time. What about those people that have one of those memories and they know where they were on such and such a date? There are people who do appear to have this extraordinary gift that if you say 9 a.m., January 27th, 1928, they will say it's a Tuesday. I don't know if it is or not, I'm making it up. And what I was doing, if they were alive then, was this, and this. And some of that can be checked, the dates. But is the actual experience accurate, or could it have been moved around? Probably, but I couldn't say for certain. By and large, most of us, the vast majority of the population, have experiences in our memories that are not exact. The colour of a dress may be different, what somebody said may be different. So it's kind of my answer. And thank you. Advanced Watcher has said, experiences taught me that I don't remember experience exactly as they happened. Disappointing, but true. Yes. And some people say, well, the older you get, you know. But I think that is the case. I've seen this recently in discussions with people. It's like, no, I didn't say that. I said this, and surely you're wrong, and that didn't happen. And I believe it is partly because emotions are often at work. You could argue almost always. It's just they may be in a sort of neutral state, but they can help change and warp how that emotion, that memory with that emotional tag is stored. And if it doesn't happen at that point, then there is an emotion very often, if not always, attached to a memory. And when it's recalled, that can warp it and change it. And of course, we also add in present information, and we can add in our perspective on what we maybe thought we should have said at that point. So it's kind of frighteningly fallible in many ways. And so I agree. Also wondering, what about the experiences where no one is totally immersed? Right. Okay. So I'm going to take a guess at that, and thank you very much for the question. So if someone isn't totally immersed, my take on that, and I could be wrong in terms of what was meant, but my take on that is that if we're not fully present and in the moment, is our memory, is it remotely reliable? It's a guesstimate because I have, I've read some stuff about it, but I've also got personal experience. So let's just stick, in fact, to personal experience. If I am immersed in something, let's say that's studying something, it's learning something, my ability to recall the facts and the information is relatively high. and it tends to be quite accurate. One could argue that's because I'm studying with a view to remember, true, but I'm also immersed in it. But I can tell you about a conversation last night where I was not immersed. And I was talking to someone, and there was a difference of opinion. No, not an argument. It was sort of differing opinions. And so somebody said I think it was the name of a hotel. Let's say that name of a hotel, and they said it, and then later on in the conversation, I said, "What was the name of the hotel?" And they said, "Well, I'd already mentioned the name of the hotel," and I went, "Oh yeah, you did," and it was, and it took a while to recall it because I wasn't paying enough attention, and so one could argue that being immersed is more fully present in terms of attention, which I think it is, and not being immersed is sort of surface skimming. It's just doing enough. And what I was doing in that conversation, don't tell anyone, was I was paying just enough attention to get through the conversation. In other words, it was that kind of, the listening ladder where you're sort of actively listening and you're fully present or you're pretending. And I was kind of pretending. So I know that answers, but that what you meant by the question, but that's my reply for the moment. But anyway, thank you very much for that. So here we go. What is the peak end rule? Definition: experiences are judged by the most intense moment, peak, and the endings. This is kind of what we've heard before. And this was coined by Daniel Kahneman and Barbara Friedrichsen, who I've talked a lot about over the years. Oh, Barbara. And she looks a lot at emotional well-being. As an aside, I really liked her work on the what we might call the sort of more upbeat emotions. It's not the best label because emotions just are, and maybe those downbeat emotions. And it wasn't that you wanted everything to be upbeat, like joy and happiness all the time. That's unrealistic, and it misses out anger, and it misses out anxiety, which are emotions which can help protect us in many ways. That's why they're there. And she sort of came up and said, for sort of good emotional stability, it's something like, let's say, can't remember the exact figure, let's say 3-1. Good, inverted commas, emotions to negative ones. But for peak periods in our lives, it's something like 5-1. And I just liked the way she broke that down and looked at things that way. So same with Daniel Kahneman. He's system 1, system 2, how we process things automatically. So these people have got a lot of research behind them. And so they come up with this idea, or so history records. Maybe we're misremembering. So an example of a vacation ending well is remembered as amazing, even if average overall. Now, the implication there would be that the peaks in the middle of it, during it, weren't that high, whether they were good or bad. And if they were good or bad, they would still be noted. We would still remember it as being good in part because of at least one of the peaks in the middle, good or bad. But they suggest in this peak end rule that a huge amount of weight is placed, and at what point does the peak experience in the middle outweigh the one at the end? I don't think they got that far. I don't think you could break it down to that extent in a statistically significant way that would be replicable in terms of psychological experiments, and a lot of things aren't. So I think, again, I come back to this as a rule of thumb, but I do believe it is a useful one. So essentially, the broad heuristic, which is a rule of thumb of a rule of thumb, a vacation ending well is remembered as amazing, even if average overall. So if we take that as our easy to sort of grasp and probably accept example, if the vacation had nothing particularly outstanding, it was fine, but the end of it was great or amazing, then we tend to remember it well. That makes sense. So the weighting is toward the end. In the peak end rule example, So here's one of the ways that Friedrichs and Kahneman decided that this was a thing. That there have been many experiments done, and one of them was this. And yes, I know we're going to extrapolate something to do with holidays and life to a little experiment with water, but hopefully it makes the point that we're trying to get to. So the experiment went as follows. Someone would put their hand, they'd be asked to put their hand in ice water. So the short trial was 60 seconds at, let's say, 14 degrees C. Sometimes it was colder than that. The long trial was 60 seconds at 14 degrees C also, but the water was then heated up, and I can't remember, like say 20 degrees, something like that. I can't remember the exact figure. And so it was slightly warmer. And the point being that the end of the trial was much more comfortable than the end of the first trial. The short trial, it ended in discomfort. It was like, oh gosh, I'm glad to get my hand out of there. The long trial, it ended in a relatively pleasant feeling. And so most chose, meaning which one did they think was better? Most people thought it was the longer trial. Subjectively, that was their choice, because it was the more painful trial, in the sense that they were still submerged in water, and sometimes the water itself for the 60 seconds was even colder, but it ended less painfully, if that makes sense. So just to make that even clearer, they could and have tried in some of those experiments to reduce from the short trial to the longer trial the temperature of the water, so it was even colder and less bearable. But because it ended warmer, then it was fine. And yeah, it you could argue there's all sorts of things that we could interpret from that, but that was the basis of it. And I put it up here because I think it's a reasonable shorthand way to consider what these researchers are attempting to say. In other words, we can forget certain things, we can average them out, but we tend to give importance, salience to other things. And the end of things, that walk away experience and therefore memory, we tend to give a fair amount of weighting to. Are there exceptions to that? Yeah, of course there are. Of course there are. But as an average, this seems to be quite a strong and predictable effect. That makes sense. So why it happens? Well, we started off with me talking about memory. So memory doesn't equal experience. Brains don't record continuously, allegedly. Some people would suggest that isn't the case. We recall snapshots. Certainly in terms of our eyes, if people are able to see, then it does seem to be almost like the frames in a movie, or the number of impressions on a digital electronic camera, that there's maybe 50 frames a second, or 60, I think. Is it 120, the human eye, or is that peak? Something like that. So there are a series of snapshots, and of course we don't take on board everything that we see anyway. There's all sorts of studies which show that, where we don't notice something walking across a room because we're looking in the other direction. The gorilla basketball one, look that one up. If you know what it is, it should be on YouTube. And people are asked to focus on how many bounces one team takes off the basketball, and there's only about 4 or 5 players in each, and a person in a gorilla costume walks through the middle of it and literally beats his or her chest as a gorilla, and a lot of people don't see it. And I remember I played this one time to a group. We were making a point about something, and the one of the guys in the room was so adamant that I had swapped the tape. It was I don't know if it was actually tape or the video file, that he bet his car he said that you've got two versions of that. There was no gorilla, and put his car keys on the table. And of course, I proved him wrong and took the car. No, that was James Bond, wasn't it, with the Aston Martin or something like that? No, I didn't get the car, but I could have done because it wasn't altered. And so we not only was his memory false, it was false because his attention was elsewhere. And so we don't recall. But somebody could argue that somewhere in the brain that gorilla was there, but the guy just hadn't give it enough importance, so couldn't recall it in his memory, and it may just not be there anyway. Again, one of the mysteries that I believe are still out there. So snapshots, those snapshots equal the peak and the end. Those things that are good or bad. So theoretically, we could have peak experiences in the middle of a holiday that were bad, but the end was good. And might that even it out? It probably would take the sting out of some of the not so good experiences on that holiday. Then, so everyday examples. I definitely resonate with the first one. A weak ending ruins a great film, and I just think that's so true. Because have you ever watched a movie and you get to the end of it and you think, what? Really? No, they jumped the shark with that one. There's no way they could have gotten out of that. I was suspending my disbelief, but not now. I don't believe that. Or the weak ending was like a cop-out because it wouldn't have happened in real life. Or it was something that was incredibly disappointing because you didn't think that the character would have done that. So whatever it may be, when you have that experience, and I've certainly had it, and if you've had it, this could mean TV shows as well, streaming services, and you get to the end of it and you think, no, that ruined it. Another example was just sprung to mind. I have to say, I wasn't an avid follower of it just because of time, but was Game of Thrones. The Game of Thrones, people hated apparently the last season, or at least quite a few episodes, because of the way it ended and all sorts of stuff. So does it diminish the rest of the body of the work? Potentially. A customer service, forgiven if it ends positively. Now, right away, of course, that's not necessarily true either, but one could see how, I hope, how if something wasn't going that great, but it was resolved in a way that made the customer feel good, then overall, if it doesn't iron out all the kinks along the way of the total experience of the customer, it goes some way to salve some of those rougher patches. And it says here, vacations, the last day matters most. Now, I'm not sure about that. I've alluded to that already. But certainly what I would say is that I've come away from trips, vacations, visits, whatever it may be. And if the last day hasn't been good, then I've heard myself say that took the edge of it. It's a real shame. But I'll still remember those good bits. But whereas if the last day was good and there were other peak experiences in there that were good peak experiences, then wow, it was absolutely amazing. But that last day, the end of the movie, does make a difference. The weighting of it, how important it is, I think is very subjective. We're all different. It would depend on the circumstances, etc., etc. But I do think it is important. And then medical procedures, shorter. It isn't necessarily remembered as better. So I'm not going to get into that. That's just from the literature and what some people have written about the sort of peak end experience. But you can imagine how if the end of whatever it was a good outcome, then you can forgive stuff along the way, even if it were longer. So, applications, healthcare, end procedures less painfully, gives them a better memory. They can't always do that. Again, this is just what people have written about it. I'm summarizing here. Can't always do it, but I think it is worth bearing in mind because if you walked away and it was like, okay, that was fine. That wasn't really painful. It wasn't emotionally painful, if possible. It wasn't harrowing. Then overall, people go away and maybe are more likely to go back, which would be an important thing if they should be, if that was the advice. Customer experience, we've already talked about that, the last interaction. But again, this isn't a business course, but what I would say is that nobody should count on that. Shouldn't count on saying, let me give you the most horrendous experience possible, but at the end we'll give you a picnic hamper and you should feel good, because that's not really going to work. Education. Finish lessons with strong takeaways. So, no eating in the classroom. Oh, they mean that sort of takeaway. I was thinking about that, and I've attended a fair amount of lectures and stuff like that over the years, and I think that one of the things I would say is that a strong takeaway that can help people, in my opinion, is one that doesn't stress. In other words, it should summarize, it should say, here's obviously the takeaways, what you really need to remember, and maybe here's a way to remember it, or here's what you should focus on. Because if people get stressed and worried, so the end might be a summary, but it's incomprehensible, or it isn't a summary, there's too much there. If people walk away with that fear, then it makes learning and also embedding of the information of memory, it can impair that process. So you want them to walk away going, yeah, okay, that's so well put, that really summarizes things. It makes me feel I've got a bit of a grip on this. I've still got more to do. And so for me, that would be a strong takeaway. Personal life, end events, dates, talks, trips, try and end them on a high note. Sometimes life gets in the way, but once more, the message there is that what we need to do and be aware of is that when we do a lot of work in whatever situation it is, and we then, for whatever reason, do something that is in our control, like our mood, our behaviors, our words, that we kind of know might just be our opinion and we don't have to share it, and we put it out there, and it might damage the situation, but we just get a bit bloody minded that day and we say, no, I'm going to say this, that it can flatten everything for the other person or other people. And we may be saying to ourselves, yeah, but there were all those good things. Yeah, but you flattened it at the end. What were you thinking? I've certainly done that. Didn't mean to, but I've done it. So, how then does that it take us to the ultimately Kairos and Chronos? So, this slide here, peak end rule and happiness. We misremember life episodes. Yep. And duration neglect, which again, is a strange way to put it. Longer doesn't necessarily mean better remembered. No, because emotions tend to do that for us. We tend to remember those things that have, for whatever reason, a high emotional content for us, because the brain says, you were really feeling something there. I need to code that, and I need it to be accessible, and I need to put as much information in as possible because that was important. And so you've given me this important memory because you've tagged it with these emotions which are strong, whether they be good or bad, and I'm going to encode that with as much information and detail as possible. It still may not be totally accurate, but it is there. And so longer doesn't mean better remembered. Very often it's much more about the emotional content, about the importance that we give it in our lives. And if it is important, then emotions are attached to it. And memory focuses on the best part and the ending. Again, true as a big generalization. So here we go. Reflection. Think of your last vacation. I just thought I'd put this in. Here's the week takeaway. Think of your last vacation, if you had one. And again, vacation, it's a nice word for slides. You might call it holidays, you might call it trip, you might call it a day out, you might call it a couple of hours doing something. What stands out more, the whole trip or one highlight plus how it ended? And we're all different. Now, if I think about that and think about the last time that I had a trip or a vacation, which doesn't easily come to mind, certainly not that type of holiday, but let me think about the last time that I was with a group of friends. What I'm thinking about are a couple of those highlights that come up, good ones, I'm glad to say, and I can remember the end of it when people were saying cheerio, because that was important. It was a bit poignant, but it was also nice. So yeah, I can pick those out. But is that just because I'm directed to do it from the slide? Maybe in part. Hopefully you get the point. But if you think about the trip, the vacation, what do you remember? Do you remember the peak points, good or bad? Do you remember the ending of it? So let me then go here, and we'll lose the slides, at least for the moment. And essentially, I want to now talk about, there we go, Kairos and Chronos, to loop it back to that. As I was saying yesterday, when we're in this Chronos time, the chronological, the linear, the measuring, then it tends to be quite rules based. At least that's my description of it. That we're following something. There is a sequence, there is a timing, there's stuff that we've got to do at that point. And as I said yesterday, it is important to have those structures in our lives. At least it's important for me. Maybe for some people they just simply don't care, but for an awful lot of us it's quite important, because without those frameworks we can drift aimlessly, we become unproductive, we can become listless, and we essentially at the end of the day can look back at it and think, well, hold on a second, I didn't actually get much done. And so that's not Kairos, because it's not meaningful and it's not rich. It's Chronos, but a very corrupted version of it. We're clock watching, but we're not doing anything with those spaces in between those periods of time that we're measuring by looking at the watch, looking at the clock, or whatever. Doesn't mean to say sitting down and daydreaming is wrong. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about a day where we're not productive for whatever reason. We procrastinate, we clock watch. We're still in Chronos. It's not Kairos. Kairos, by its very nature, as I was saying yesterday, is about being present, is about, to use the word in the comment, and thank you again, immersed, when we're totally immersed in that situation. And if you think about the peak experiences, then, and we'll use the holiday as the example, then definitely we want to do something at the end which is nice. We want it to be a good day or a good hour or a good trip. There's only so much we can do to ensure that, which is where I come back to the peak end experience and say, yeah, it could be bad, it could be good, but we can't ultimately totally control it. But what we can do is we can pay attention to those bits, those moments in time during that holiday, again, as a holiday is the example, where we're really, really in the moment, and to slow it down, and to be focused, and to not clock watch. And some holidays can be a disaster from start to finish, right? Okay, there are definitely exceptions, and I've been there, but most of the time there are good things in it. And so my rule of thumb, talking about another rule of thumb, is that when I'm going somewhere and I think I really want to enjoy this, and there's parts of it where it's mundane, it's just not enjoyable because it's something that's, maybe it's a queue, let's say at the airport, then I'll try and think about other things. I'll focus on something, and I may get into at that point in time more Chronos time to go, okay, I could sit and check a few emails, I could do that stuff. And so at least at the end of that period of time that may have been wasted, I feel a bit productive, which evens out the mood, takes away some of the frustration from, let's say, the gigantic queue. Again, that's not always possible. It's just an example. But when I'm in those moments when things are going well or good enough, I really want to slow things down. And that is where I absolutely don't want to be near that Chronos time, because I want to be totally immersed. I want time to slow down, or at least to warp and change, like that state of flow, Csikszentmihalyi's idea of, hey, like I said yesterday, where did the day disappear to? I've been so in this moment. And so I'm more conscious of saying, right, let's just forget about that stuff, put it aside, and be involved in this. And when I can't do that, or the experience leads me towards something that maybe is inherently boring, difficult to get into a state of flow with, frustrating, I may deliberately try and do the Chronos stuff. Why then, and how does that link to the peak end experience? Well, as we've just been covering, we tend to remember the peaks and we tend to remember the end. And so I want to have as high and as many of a peak in that experience, which is good. And one of the ways for me to make it good is to be immersed in it. Of course, this could mean that things happen that are bad on a holiday or bad anywhere. All I'm trying to do is stack the deck in my favour, my experiential favour, so that when I get away and I revisit that holiday in terms of memory, and of course during it as well, it is as rich and nuanced and in many ways nourishing emotionally as possible. So I have this kind of Kairos Chronos in mind, not all the time. Very often it will come back to me and I think, okay, what am I doing now? And also I'm aware of the fact that the memory of that holiday or whatever it is will be heavily influenced by the peaks. Some of them can be negative, of course, and some of them we can't control. But often, although not always, if we're in the moment more in Kairos time, and remember being a little bit impulsive, being opportune, I said yesterday, and looking for that joy, practicing that away from Chronos time. Very often these experiences come out as not just on holiday, I mean in life, day-to-day stuff, and the ability to then drink that experience in overall, in my opinion, can help reduce the sting of the bits that may be the negative experience. And we can try to have that end experience as good as possible. Well, we arranged to go, I don't know, on a boat trip before we catch the plane. And so it should be good. But it rained, the boat broke down. Then for me, that's partly emotional intelligence, awareness and management of emotions, curation of emotions, to say, all right, what can we do instead of that? Walk along the beach, watch the sunset. So in that mix, yeah, that there is something also about emotional intelligence for me to make that peak end experience not necessarily manageable, because it won't always be, but to give us a chance of it actually happening. But one of the things, as it said, it's not just the peak end experience, it's the peaks in the middle, positive or negative, the end positive or negative. But what can we control in that is we can control, not necessarily always, but a lot more than we think, our ability to consider a situation and to consider it from not Chronos necessarily, we might, but to remember about Kairos and to say, what can I do to be fully immersed in this? How can I make this something that keeps me curious and open-minded and intrigued and enjoying the experience and or the learning process? Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Let me see. I think I've answered everything there as far as I can see so far. So I hope you enjoyed that. It's a bit different. It's not quite. I can't call it high philosophy, but the reason I talk about this stuff is because I believe it is important to give ourselves the space and the time and the place to consider our experiences and that, again, a hackneyed word, but our journey through this thing called life, and those little tweaks and insights can sometimes, particularly over a reasonable period of time, allow us to get more out of it, allow it to be more enjoyable and beneficial. And if it's beneficial for us, then by reflection it will tend to be beneficial to the people around us, because we're in a better state, we're calmer, we're more relaxed, we're perhaps happier, and very often therefore more productive and nicer to be around. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning into that. If you're watching live, thank you for the comments, really appreciated that and the question. And if you're watching the recording, again, thanks for listening thus far. If you haven't, of course, subscribed, please think about it. It does make a big difference on this platform. You've no idea, it really does. Anyway, hope you have a good day or evening or morning, whatever it is for you. For the moment, from me, bye for now.